Shalom. We're starting today a series of 4 lectures about the great scholar Yehezkel Kaufmann, who was a historian, a biblical scholar, and a Zionist thinker. This session, the first one, will discuss the man and his world, his biography, his intellectual portrait, and his significance in his times and maybe also in ours. Kaufmann was one of the most original Jewish thinkers of the 20th century. His student, a very important biblical scholar, Menachem Aran, captured the breadth of Kaufmann's vocation. He wrote like this: Kaufmann was not merely a biblical scholar. He was also a historian, a philosopher of history, a scholar of religions, a sociologist, a literary critic, a publicist, and a sage who pondered the future towards which we are moving. At the burning center of his entire work stood one urgent question, the question of the continued existence of the Jewish people. This lecture will introduce Kaufmann through 3 lenses: his life and biography, his intellectual portrait as a scholar and as a Zionist, and a very short survey of his major works. In our next lectures, we will examine each of those works in greater depth. Yehezkel Kaufmann was born in 1889 in a small Ukrainian town in the Pale of Settlement, that vast zone of the Russian Empire to which Jews were legally confined. He grew up in the world of traditional Jewish learning, immersed in Tanakh, the Bible, Talmud, and rabbinic literature from his early childhood. This immersion gave him a lifelong intimacy with Jewish texts that would later prove indispensable to his scholarly work. The great pogroms of 1905 in the Russian Empire forced the Kaufmann family, like hundreds of thousands of other Jewish families, to relocate. And the young Yehezkel Kaufmann, with his parents, moved to the city of Odessa, the great port city on the shores of the Black Sea that had become by that time one of the most important centers of modern Hebrew and Jewish culture. In Odessa, the young Yehezkel Kaufmann enrolled in the Yavne Yeshiva, led by the rabbi and scholar Chaim Chernovitz, known in his pen name Rav Tzair, and then in the Jewish Academy established by the banker, scholar, and art collector David Ginsburg. These years formed the bridge between Kaufmann's traditional religious upbringing and his future career as a modern secular scholar. Like many young men of his generation, Kaufmann didn't remain in the Russian Empire and moved to the West. And from 1913 until 1918, during the years of the First World War, he studied philosophy and other subjects in the University of Bern in Switzerland. Switzerland was neutral during the First World War, and it provided a haven of relative calm and offered Kaufmann an exposure to the best of European scholarship. He earned his doctorate there, gaining the rigorous philosophical and philological training that would escort him during his entire career. From 1918 until 1927, Kaufmann moved to the city of Berlin in Germany. At that time, this was one of the greatest centers of Jewish culture and intellectual life. Kaufmann took part in the vibrant Hebrew literary republic that flourished over there, and was a part of a community of writers, thinkers, and scholars who were producing at that time original work in Hebrew, right in the heart of Europe. This period proved enormously productive for Kaufmann And it was during those years that he started to write his first great work, Gola, ve-Nekhar, Exile and Estrangement, a great work of scholarship which we will discuss in our next lecture. In 1928, Kaufman decided to leave Germany and to go to Eretz Israel, mandatory Palestine. He settled in Haifa and started his career as a Bible teacher in the Reali High School in that city. It was only after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1949 that Kaufman became a professor of Bible in the Hebrew University, where he also served as the head of the Department of Bible and developed an important career over there. In 1958, he was awarded the Israel Prize for Jewish Studies. He died in Jerusalem in October 1963, spending his last years in the Hebrew University continuing to work on his great book, Toledot ha-Emunah ha-Yisra'elit, the history of the religion of Israel, which we will discuss in our third session. To understand Kaufman's intellectual character, I think it is essential to grasp and understand that his scholarship was never merely academic in the narrow sense. For sure, Kaufman was a scholar of the first rank who produced works of research, written art, of fidelity to truth, intellectual integrity, breadth of vision, and an unfailing aspiration to precision. Nevertheless, anyone who reads deeply into his works and what is written about him will have to admit that Kaufman's scholarship was never written for the sake of scholarship alone. He had other, one might say even nobler purposes. He was utterly committed in the intellectual sense, and even more than that, in the emotional sense, to the Jewish people and to the question of their survival and revival. Another great historian, Ben Zion Dinur, who knew Kaufman personally, left us a description of the man, which I think brings together his special character, but also the strong sense that what he was doing wasn't merely an academic, intellectual inquiry. Ben Zion Dinur wrote, "His figure was extraordinary. By nature, he was modest and shy, gentle and delicate, fastidious in mind and soul, a man of deep feeling and nobility of spirit. He possessed of a fine sense of humor and a soul that yearned for friendship and was full of love for his fellow human beings. And yet, in the course of his life, over the last decades, a different figure of Kaufman took shape, completely closed and self-enclosed, restrained in speech, limited in his social encounters, suppressing his emotions, silencing his impulses, weighing his words, and yet firm, even very firm in his opinions, solitary in his home room tent, concentrated and focused, armed. It is hard to exaggerate the suffering and sorrow that were bound up for him in the path of solitude and asceticism he had imposed upon himself. A spirit of a sense of mission was upon him, and its strong hand shaped the path of his life and imprinted itself upon the character and style of his work. So this sense, or one might say strong sense of mission, is a very important part of Kaufman's life, especially in the last decades of his life, and we will return to it in our lectures. Another interesting testimony about Yehezkel Kaufmann comes to us from the great novelist Aaron Appelfeld, who took some of his lectures in the Hebrew University in the early 1950s. Here too we have a very fine description of the man in his times, and with it an attempt to explain what he was doing beyond or in a deeper layer of his intellectual work. So Appelfeld writes like this: in the early 1950s, the Hebrew University was home to Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, Ernst Simon, Yehezkel Kaufmann, to name only a few. All of them possessed broad Jewish and general learning, and all chambers of knowledge and belief were open before them, masters of ancient and modern languages. What they shared, broadly speaking, was a post-assimilatory relationship to Judaism. The Jewish concern was in their very souls. Each, in his own way, had a warm and committed relationship to the Jewish tradition. Yehezkel Kaufmann sought to redeem the Bible from Christian scholarship. That final phrase, that Kaufmann sought to redeem the Bible from Christian scholarship, cuts to the heart of his intellectual project and mission. As we will see in greater detail in lecture number 3, Kaufmann believed that the dominant tradition of modern biblical criticism had been shaped consciously or unconsciously by Christian theological assumptions, specifically by a Protestant narrative in which ancient Israel was a sinful nation that rejected the ethical monotheism proclaimed by the prophets, and whose historical destruction described in the Bible was, and then later in the days of the Second Temple by the Romans, was a punishment from God, and for this rejection, and most importantly, a punishment that led to the replacement of the Jewish nation with Christianity. Against this reading, Kaufmann set out to prove, with Kaufmann's understanding of contemporary Jewish history and the development of Zionism, and even the creation of the Jewish state. We shall return to all this in our next lectures. No account of Yehezkel Kaufmann's intellectual biography is complete without discussing his polemic against the Ahad Ha'am, the pen name of Asher Ginsberg, one of the most influential Zionist intellectuals of his time, and the creator of what was later called spiritual Zionism. Understanding this debate helps us to clarify what was at stake in Kaufmann's own vision of Jewish history. Let us say now a few words about Ahad Ha'am in order to understand Kaufmann's critique of him. Ahad Ha'am was, as I said, a leading Hebrew intellectual in the turn of the 19th and 20th century, and he had a strong belief that Jewish religion that preserved Jewish existence throughout its long history was disintegrating under the pressures of modernity. Ahad Ha'am, a leading Hebrew intellectual in the turn of the 19th and 20th century, believed that the Jewish religion, who preserved Jewish existence throughout its long history, was disintegrating under the pressures of modernity. However, he did not believe that these pressures were about to lead to the disappearance of the Jewish people. In his eyes, the Jews had what he called in Hebrew a chefetz kiyum, a phrase one might translate to English as a will to exist, some innate power that drove the Jewish people to self-preservation, and a power that will ensure that they will survive even in modern times. Ahad Ha'am's understanding of Zionism was accordingly cultural rather than political. Theodor Herzl, who entered the scene of Zionism in the 1890s, saw Zionism mainly as a political movement which goal was to save Jewish existence under the threats it found itself in Europe. Echad Ha'am thought that the main goal of Zionism was creating a spiritual center for Jewish existence in the land of Israel in order to create some kind of new identity of secular and national foundations. This identity was to replace the role religion played in Jewish existence until modern times. Yehezkel Kaufmann disagreed sharply with Echad Ha'am. He didn't agree with his analysis and did this on several grounds. First of all, he argued that this concept, which we called in Hebrew Chefetz Kiyum, postulated a unique biological or spiritual dimension in the existence of the Jewish people, a dimension that set them apart from all other nations. But Kaufman said or wrote that Echad Ha'am never offered any historical explanation for how such a thing as Chefetz Kiyum actually appeared. Second of all, Kaufman contended that the actual historical record showed that the Jewish factor that had preserved Jewish existence was not some kind of biological drive, but a concrete historical phenomenon. It was the specific context of the Jewish religion that prevented its full assimilation, even when Jews were exposed to powerful forces of integration. As we will see already in our next lecture about Kaufmann's great work, Gola ve-Nekhar, Exile and Estrangement, this for Kaufman was the major explanation of Jewish existence. So one can say that in Kaufman's worldview, Echad Ha'am's explanation was mystical, where it should have been historical, and vague when it should have been precise. Now, this debate wasn't merely academic. It bore directly on the question of what form Jewish nationalism should take. If Echad Ha'am was right, what was needed for the Jewish people in the turning of the 19th and 20th century was some kind of cultural renaissance and the creation of a spiritual center, not mass immigration or political sovereignty, which was the direction Herzl was leading. But if Herzl was right, and that was Kaufmann's opinion, what was needed in face of the crisis of modernity was a physical homeland where Jews could live as a nation in the full sense, economically, politically, and then also in the cultural dimension. Kaufman definitely understood Echad Ha'am's approach, and one could say that in many ways he could be seen as part of Echad Ha'am's intellectual circles. After all, Echad Ha'am himself lived at the time in the city of Odessa, and they were in many senses very close to each other. One can say this debate between these two great figures was not merely academic. It bore directly on the question of what form modern Jewish nationalism should take. If Echad Ha'am was right, what was needed for the Jewish people at this time of crisis was some kind of cultural renaissance and the creation of a spiritual center, not mass immigration or political sovereignty. On the other hand, if Herzl was right, and this is what Kaufman believed, what was needed for the Jews was a physical homeland where they could live as a nation in the full sense, economically, politically, and also from the cultural dimension. It's important to understand that Yehezkel Kaufmann and Echad Ha'am were close. First of all, in the shared biography, after all, they both came down to the city of Odessa from the Pale of Settlement after growing up in a religious environment and becoming secular Jews. And one even can look at the pictures in front of us over here and see that they belong to the same world of social circles and cultural tastes. However, Yehezkel Kaufmann didn't believe in ha-Am's understanding of Jewish history, and not in his solution for the Jewish problem from the Zionist perspective. And one can say that Kaufmann definitely saw the importance of the cultural revival ha-Am was looking for, but he believed it will come out of the entire nation after it wins political sovereignty, and not led by some kind of elite group, which was ha-Am's vision. I think it's fair to say that this debate between these two figures regarding the cultural dimension of Zionism in many ways can be relevant even today. So we now have a short description of Yehezkel Kaufmann's biography, his intellectual portrait, and his role in Zionism and Zionistic thought. We should say a few words about his two major works, which we will discuss in lectures 2 and 3. So Kaufmann left us two monumental books. The first and earlier major book was, as I mentioned before, Gola ve-Nekhar, Exile and Estrangement, a vast historical and sociological study of the fate of the Jewish people from antiquity until his times. This book was written mainly in Germany in the 1920s and was published in 1929. The second work you can see in front of you over here is called in Hebrew Toledot, ha-Emunah ha-Yisra'elit. One can translate it to the history of Israelite religion. This book was written mainly in Jerusalem and eventually published in 4 great volumes in 1956. In our next two lectures, we will discuss the deep connection that exists between these two books, and this connection itself will help us to understand even in a deeper way the intellectual portrait of Yehezkel Kaufmann. Beyond these two great works, Kaufmann wrote commentaries of 2 books of the Bible, the Tanakh, Joshua and Judges, Yoshua and Shoftim, and also published a collection of important essays about Zionism. In our 4th lecture, we will discuss one of those essays. I think it's also important to mention over here that we do have an English translation done by Moshe Greenberg of Toledot ha-Emunah ha-Yisra'elit. It was published under the title The Religion of Israel. It appeared in 1960 and made Kaufmann's ideas accessible to the intellectual scholarly community beyond Israel and Hebrew-speaking culture. To sum up, I think one could say that Kaufmann's importance rests on several pillars. As a historian of religion, he proposed one of the most comprehensive and coherent accounts of Israelite religion produced in the 20th century. As a philosopher of Jewish history, Kaufmann offered what remains one of the most systematic and historically grounded account of the mechanics of Jewish survival in exile, an explanation that engages seriously with the sociological data and does not resort on mystical categories. As a Zionist thinker, Kaufmann was remarkable for his combination of clear-eyed realism. He predicted with extraordinary accuracy the nature of the dangers that would befall European Jewry, and we shall get back to this point in our next lecture. And finally, as a scholar of the Hebrew language and a writer of Hebrew prose, Kaufman stands in the great tradition of great Hebrew intellectual writing alongside figures as Echad Ha'am, Chaim Nachman Bialik, and Gershom Shalom, who saw in the Hebrew language not merely a vehicle for scholarship, but a medium of national renaissance. In our next lectures, we will quote a few times from Kaufman's writings, and it is important for me to quote them both in Hebrew and then in the English translation, just to make the point of the very high quality of his Hebrew prose. So with this introduction in mind, let us now turn in lecture 2 to Kaufman's first great work, Gola ve-Nekhar, Exile and Estrangement.